Hello everyone, welcome to Strange Adventures. I'm here with my friend and colleague TrooperSJP to discuss how does failure work in tabletop role-playing games, whether that is mechanical, narrative, or otherwise, and maybe give you some ideas about how you can use failure or avoid situations where it might not be interesting in your game. So, Trooper, hi.
Hello. I'm so excited to be here. I'm excited for this very strange adventure. So I think one of the things that's to really back up first off, right? So there's an idea that that people don't like failure. Failure is frustrating. It doesn't feel good. Nobody likes to fail. Yeah. You don't like to lose. And so therefore we should maybe not have it, right? Or that failure stops the story. There's a lot of sort of framing of failures as sort of as negative for both the player and for the game, for the story. And I just want to first off note that for me, the character failing is not the same thing as the player failing.
Yeah.
Right. That I actually don't think those things are the same. And I think that sometimes, especially people out of bleed, or they can be conflated. But sometimes I don't want my character to succeed. Sometimes that is not what I want. Sometimes my character might want to do some stuff. And I was like, well, I hope they don't succeed at that one, right? You know what I mean? To actually maybe disconnect the player and the character a little bit.
Yeah.
The character's success is not necessarily yours, and the player's success is not necessarily yours. Or failure, right there.
Yeah.
Those are slightly different. And I think this comes for me. I was always rooted. When I first started playing D&D back in the day, there was a thing that somebody said, and I clearly internalized this in a way that maybe other people did not. And it was, in RPGs, you cannot win or lose. There's no winning or losing in RPGs.
Oh, I like that.
Right. And I internalized that. So if I really and truly believe that there's no winning and losing in RPGs, I personally don't really think there are failures. Right now, there are things that are frustrating, but yes. I find that what is frustrating is not necessarily failure. For me, it is poor mechanics, or mechanics that don't match what the game says it's doing. And so then I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Or interpretations of those dice rolls that also don't make any sense. Or a too narrow idea of how the game is going, right? So for example, if we walk into a room and it's dark or whatever, and I say roll perception, and everybody rolls perception and they all fail their perception roll.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So I think this is several things. So people go into a room, they're looking for clues, and I've been using this a lot recently, is do they even have to roll? It's to perceive stuff, there's, I don't know, in this room there could be a lever that does something. They don't know what it does. That might be a consequence of failure, whether it's on a scale of figuring out what it's connected to, like the door, or rocks in the ceiling, or a trap, or whatever exciting thing you've got planned for them. I think it's more interesting if the players know things, and that creates options for them, which they can then fail when they interact with.
And for me, I'm also thinking, what is the purpose of that role? I think this is actually really important. What is it doing? And I'm going to use the door, right? The door. So there's a locked door. There's a locked door. And
there's always a locked door.
There's always a locked door. So if you come to the locked door, the first question, back in D&D, they might say, okay, roll to pick the lock. And then they don't pick the lock. So then the GM's going to that's going to ruin the story. The story won't go anywhere. So I'll just fudge the roll. So I'll just say, actually, you got it anyway. Either we don't need to roll, right? We don't need to roll. If
you're a master locksmith, why would you need to roll? There's no problem.
Sure. But I probably would have them roll. But here's the thing. And this is where I have a very different philosophy than a lot of people in this way. I don't think fundamentally that just because you failed to pick the lock, that means the story's over.
Oh yeah.
Or that you can't progress. I don't think progress stops, because I don't think the only way through the door is by picking the lock.
No.
I also don't think that you necessarily have to go through the door. If you try to pick the lock and you fail to pick the lock, for me, that's an opportunity for the players to get creative. So what happens next? Maybe they're like, okay, I'm going to dismantle the hinges. And I was like, all right. Or yeah. I'm going to hack the door down, but now that might make noise, which gives you a bit of a problem because like now you're like using your axe, or maybe you're going to knock on the door and like bluff your way in, or you'll go around the side and go through a window, or like, like for me, the failure to pick that lock, like I never imagined that that's the only way to get a piece of information or do something. I always imagine that there are other things you can do, and maybe this becomes a mystery you come back to later. Like for me, I try to keep it open in a way that like I try to like I often like, well, here's some stuff I don't know what you're going to do. I'm excited to find out, and we will see. And I always find that it, like for me, it opens, like I don't think of that as a failure. I think as an opportunity to try something different. But I also, and this is really important, tend to run games where the probabilities are more clear and and like what your probabilities are, right? So if you are a master locksmith in most of the games that I like to run, you probably are not going to fail that roll. Like
because you've got more dice, or you've got
more dice
for all sorts of reasons. However, the mechanics work, right?
It's just that maybe you won't get, like, depending on what the situation is, you just maybe won't get like this little bonus bit of information, but that doesn't mean that you're incompetent or you didn't get anything at all.
Yeah.
And so I think like how do you interpret missed rolls becomes really important. Like I think you have to know what this. So I'm going to give you a vampire example where I was like, I don't like this. And I was playing a Daughter of Cacophony. I had a 10 dice pool, which is like your max for perform. And I rolled my 10 dice, and I think it came up a botch. And so the storyteller was like, oh yeah, you're just really bad. You're really horrible. It's like the worst thing ever. And I was like, and it wasn't even an important performance. Like I was just like doing a singer-songwriter thing with the guitar, doing a folk song on the stage. And that was frustrating to me, not because I failed, but because the failure didn't make sense to me, right? That I don't think that my character with a 10 dice pool would have failed in that way. I think a failure in that context would have been, you play the song, it's just not particularly, like it's not interesting, you know what I mean? Like nobody pays attention. Like that would have felt like a failure to my character, right? Like, if you are the number one rock god guitarist in the world, I just don't think a failure is you don't know how to play the guitar, right? A failure is like...
A failure is you have had too much Coke the night before and now you're throwing up. That's what
yeah, right. It could be that. Like I think that there are ways of thinking like, oh, what does that look like? Maybe your strings break. And I think this becomes, and there's a lot of discussion about how do you frame failure? Do you frame it as the players being incompetent? Do you frame it as bad luck?
A way you can answer how do you interpret missed rolls is by asking, what is this game about? Is it a mystery?
Yeah, that's right.
Are you here to unravel things? Do you need to find clues to discern who the murderer is or something like that? Or is it a rip-roaring adventure where you might miss a panel on the floor, stepping on that creates some tension, some conflict? And
then the big giant ball comes rolling down, and how exciting is that? Like sometimes, like, could you imagine what Raiders of the Lost Ark would have been like had Indiana Jones never failed any rolls? Like so much would never have happened. That would have been way less fun, right? So there's a way in which failing a die roll is like can be super fun, and like it's not failure for the player. It's exciting, right? Like, oh, now I've got to deal with like the walls coming in. Oh no, right? That sort of thing. I think you want your failures to make sense, and I think that people get frustrated when they don't make sense, right? I think if they make sense, people get frustrated. I think generally speaking, people tend to be fine with setbacks, rather than fails. Call them setbacks. Setbacks if they make sense in the world that you're playing in, and sort of having a session zero to understand what the world you're playing in, I think becomes really important. So like, for example, like some people say, well, you have to have death on the table. And I often have death on the table, although people rarely die. And in my games, I'm like, hey, you could die in this game. But if I were playing a superhero game, I wouldn't say that, because that's not what happens in that style.
And I feel like this is a base assumption that happens quite a lot when people talk about whether it's failure or how characters act, is what kind of character they are. Like you said, are they a hero? And the thing you sent me to read about move and roll versus roll and move is how heroic are they? How do they look cool while they're fighting the baddies? Is a way of thinking, but it underpins a lot of this avoiding failure talk where your character is the coolest. And while you can, in some games, spend your points to... or you only need like 1 out of the 5 points you have to escape the building. I think they had in the example, but you could get extra stuff. You could avoid hurting someone or like getting hurt yourself. I guess that rolls up into the what kind of game is this? Is your character a hero? Are they an anti-hero? Are they maybe even a villain if you're like venturing outside of the normal kinds of fantasy dungeon crawling adventures?
Vampire game maybe, or actually it's just an Evil D&D campaign. You can do that too.
That's rare on this channel, I think.
Never happens. So you were talking about sort of roll and move versus move and roll, and so for the viewers that
sorry,
John Wick, because they don't know. Right? No, there was a game designer who was talking about how there are games where you roll and then move, or move and then roll. And traditionally, a lot of RPGs, you describe what you want to do. So you move first, and then you roll to see if you were successful. So you say, I'm going to go and attack the person in the face. I roll, oh, I did not attack them in the face. I was not successful at doing that. And John Wick for 7th C second edition just didn't want to do that. He was inspired by Dead of Winter. If you've never played the board game, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I do like that game a lot. It's a kind of resource management game, and in that game, the dice are a resource. It's not about whether you roll to succeed or fail. You roll, and then you have dice numbers 1 through 6, and you spend 6s on really, really important things like going and scavenging, or you spend 1s on very basic stuff like clearing out the rubbish. Yeah.
But you can always do something, right? You can always do something. It's just, how do you want to do it? And so he wanted to design an RPG where that was the case, right? So in 7th C second edition, and I know some people who are very traditional gamers who don't get the game yet. They're like, oh, I don't get it. But you roll, like you're presented with your scene, and then you roll at the start of the scene, whatever approach you want to take, and then you get a number of successes from that, and then you decide what you want to spend your successes on.
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, well, and usually the main goal of that scene is only 1 success, right? So usually you should be able to succeed, at least on a basic level, but that doesn't mean you're not going to succeed without harm or without trouble. And maybe you choose not to. Like maybe, like if for example, you're in that room, you want to escape the room and it costs 1 to escape, and you roll 3 successes, that's pretty cool. And somebody says, okay, well, here's the thing. You can escape with 1 success and have 2 over to get some cool stuff. Or for 3 successes, you can save all of the orphans. Like there are a bunch of orphans in this room, in this burning building, and it will cost a success to save each one of them. So, and there are 3 orphans and there's you. What do you want to do with that? So as a player, you can decide, you know what, I'm going to keep 1 success for myself and I'll save 2 orphans and leave the last orphan to go. Or you can be like, you know what, I'm going to spend all 3 of my successes to get all 3 orphans out, and I'm still going to be in the building, and now I'm going to have to deal with another problem, right? But that becomes a moment where you as a player get to decide. Fate usually does have the option to succeed at a cost. If you fail, you can turn that into a success. But what one person was saying, that actually it's about finding out how much you're willing to pay to succeed. Who is your character? Is your character somebody who would leave orphans in the building? Is your character somebody who would do that? And it's like, so it becomes like, where do you want to, like, where does it matter to you? Like, and so like, and that's a very different way of thinking about failure again. Right. And, for me, I think about, so this is like an example that I bring up about a different mindset about failure a lot. And, the gumshoe system, which are all investigative games, you never fail on any investigative roll ever.
Yeah. You always end up with clues you need, and always. It's your job to interpret those to find the culprit of this that you're investigating.
So it's like it's a different challenge, right? So and I know that some people, when they first hear about, they're like, "Oh, how can that be fun?" Because when I say investigative skills, I mean all of them. I mean, if you have detect lies and somebody's lying to you, You will know it. You don't have to roll it. You will know they're lying to you. And people are like, well, how is that fun? And how can you make a mystery? And you're like, well, first off, people lie to you all the time. Like lots of people, like people who are not guilty will also lie to you. And just because you know they're lying doesn't mean you know what the truth is, right? So like, right. So there's all sorts of like, there's ways in which you can have that. And for that sort of system, it is important that you figure out who the murderer is, right? That's the goal. And so they're going to give you the clues and then you have to like puzzle it together yourself. Or Agatha Christie, if your model is, if I'm not interested in whether or not you catch the killer, I'm interested in finding out what you'll do if you don't get the clues, but you think you know who did it. So let's say
the Chicago school of thought.
Yes, the Chicago school. So let's say your detectives know who the serial killer is. Like you think you know, but you don't have the evidence. What are you going to do? Are you going to fabricate evidence? Are you going to take them out anyway? And I want to know the answer to that question. So for me, you failing to get the evidence to convict the serial killer is not a failure. Actually, it's actually just interesting.
Question the end goal of your game. Is it you save the town and you're a hero? Is it figure out who murdered someone, or is it figure out who your character is and what they would do in a tense situation, which all have varying levels of and types of excitement that you can create. And
I really love to play to find out who characters are. Like that's something that's really important to me. Like I really want, like, so you did a video recently on Saito's death.
Yeah.
And that was a whole thing. And actually, death is actually really interesting when it comes to fail states.
I wouldn't consider it failure, which is part of what the video was about, which is why we're doing this now, because you left a comment.
Yeah, totally. But some people are like, oh, no, if you die, you failed. And I was like, that depends. Saito saved somebody. Saito did something really important in the moment of his death in terms of helping Ava. Right, like Saito did this, kind of made a sacrifice. So like, then there was a lot going on in that death, but Saito made a sacrifice for Ava. When everybody else was telling Ava that Saito didn't care about her and was only using her and was like the worst ever, in this moment of death, Saito proved everyone wrong on that one. Right, like Saito's a complicated character, of course, right?
Yeah.
But he proved them wrong, and that does not seem like a failure to me. You were all wrong and you didn't understand that character. And now in this moment of death, I've showed it to you. In some ways, that was amazing. You know what I mean? Like I was personally watching it. I was like, see everyone, you know.
When a character dies or someone fails because of bad rolls, I would in general agree with the idea that rolling with the possibility of failure or loss is more interesting than having no roll at all. And the fact that there is tension in a roll and using it in an appropriate moment can get your players excited is more valuable to the drama of a situation than being able to just describe what happens.
Like, what does success looks like? What does that mean? Do you actually want to succeed? Maybe you don't. Like, do you want to fail? What does that mean? And I was thinking about games that have no dice mechanic at all.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, so there is no randomization. I was thinking about Good Society, which is diceless. Characters fail in that game all the time.
Yeah.
Also Fiasco. People fail in both of those games all the time. Usually it's the player's choice, but you get things for failing.
It's encouraged through something that you get. There's a value, right? Whether it's a drama point or fate point or whatever you want to call it, right? Because then you can spend that later.
Like, oh, let me fail here. Let me fail here so that I can and like becomes this. It becomes a way in which failure, your character failing, can be a player success.
Yes.
Right. And it can be something that you want. Like I remember there was a moment where when I was playing in Good Society, I had a character who was basically kind of like an Oscar Wilde, Lord Byron sort of person who had been disinherited. And the character goal was to get the inheritance back. He got disinherited because, he was inappropriate in public very often. And it's just one of those things. And published some scandalous poetry, and it was just too scandalous. And his goal, what success meant for him, was being reinstated so that he could become the duke of this, become the duke of this sort of duchy. Or it was probably a count of the county or something. And as we were playing, as a player, I realized that is not what is best for that character. Like, that character would actually be miserable if they had to stay in that small town being the count of this, like they really should not be there. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that is not what, like, that is like, they hate small towns. They hate the whole thing. They want to be off in Italy being debaucherous. And that if they succeeded in their goal, that would be really miserable for them. And so I didn't want them to get that goal once I realized that was not going to be good for them. Yeah. The character wanted it, but I didn't want it. And so I just sabotaged my character quite a lot. I was like, no, you actually, the forged documents that would give you the inheritance are lost. Boom. But then the other players are like, oh, no, we do find the paperwork. And I was like, oh. I was like, and so there's something really interesting about being able to understand when maybe your character failing is actually good, is like a positive thing, is something that maybe you as a player might want. And so it's not a failure, right? Yeah. Or that it just opens up other spaces. Yeah.
And I think that leads into another point I wanted to make, which is that you need to trust your players. You need to, if they've never played a game before, talk to them like, if you want to do something interesting and it doesn't involve you, I guess, winning, succeeding, progressing in a positive sense, do it. Please make problems for yourselves. And try and make the story more interesting for you, everyone else. And creating that conflict, creating the tension is a job for everyone and not just the GM. You learn about these things as you play often. You don't know from the beginning that you don't want your Byron to end. You probably decided that you wanted him to end up as a count because you thought that would be cool. That's where you started, but where you end up is somewhere very, very different. And having the opportunities to fail are what create that journey.
But I actually think it might be interesting to think about player and GM failure. Like, when do I feel as a player that I, as a player, have failed, even if my character has not failed? And what does player failure mean? Because when I feel like I failed as a player is when I feel like, oh, dang, I didn't toss the spotlight over to that person I could have. Like, there was a really great opportunity for me to give a fellow player a really cool moment, and I didn't see it. Oh, dang it. Or I didn't get that rule right. And that like it wasn't my character that messed up. It was me because I messed up that rule and I should have been paying attention more on that one.
And it would have changed the context of the situation. And
as a GM, I feel like I have GM fails all the time.
I think out of everyone, GMs fail the most consistently because there's multiple things going on. They have a lot more characters, situations, things to help other people do. And rule books are big, man. Most people just forgive that stuff. Like, you make a mistake on a rule, you make a mistake about what someone said, you're like, just annoying.
It's just what happened, and you're like, dang it. Yeah. And I think that goes really back to that very beginning, that in an RPG, there's no winners or losers. It's, and so like thinking about, and like,
no
and I'll be like,
the worst thing is frustration often.
Yeah, the worst thing is frustration, right? And then you just reframe it.
And everyone works past it.
D&D is a zero to hero game, right?
Yes.
First of all, D&D characters are
weak. That's where most people die. You lose your characters. There's all sorts of mostly mechanical reasons for that, right?
Yeah. The level 20 D&D characters,
basically gods.
That's a journey. And somebody said to me, and this is related to failure, I swear. Somebody said to me, do you think you could have a game where you don't level up? And I was like, sure. Actually, I actually know a number of games where actually that is the case. You just have to have the right genre, right? So like if you're playing a pulp action adventure game, most of those characters don't actually level up over the course of the stories. They start super competent and they stay super competent.
Yeah, you're
right?
playing
Or a lot of superheroes.
Flash Gordon.
too.
Flash Gordon is amazing at American football, and so he can get the weird gold egg and charge through a room full of guards. Like, that's always been a thing he could do.
Always. And so he doesn't need to level up to do that. He's just already there.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're going to run a game like that, one, don't make them underpowered, right? Because then they're going to get failures in ways that don't make any sense for what that game is about. Progression is not the point. Look, Flash Gordon does not really develop as a character. Like, that's not the point. It's not the point of that genre, right? So, like, what is the point of the genre? If you're playing a game about character exploration, then failure becomes really important because it helps you define your character.
Yes.
Right? Like, what you fail at and how you deal with adversity and how you deal with failure really helps you explore who that character is. But if that's not what the game you're playing, then failure has to have a different role, right? Failure becomes about the exciting boulder that's rolling down that gives you a new action to do. Pondering what kind of game you are and what does failure and success look like will reduce frustration. Because I think the problem is not failure or success. The problem is frustration.
Yes.
And in some games, I would be really frustrated if all I did was succeed, because that wouldn't give me what I want.
It gets boring.
All the time. I'm always like, I'm never making absolutes, right?
Yeah.
I'm not making absolutes, right? This is like always depending on. If you think I'm making an absolute, I'm not. Taking failure off the table, or more specifically, making failure so awful, I think can make it worse. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say you're playing D&D, for example, because other games have different mechanics. So, and also D&D, actually, this is something that quote unquote should not happen in D&D, but because if failure is the worst, right, then you cannot fail. So if you're in a fight with some monsters, well, that tends to mean that people don't retreat because they see retreat as failure.
Yeah.
But maybe you should retreat, right? Like, maybe there are moments when retreating is the best idea. And if you can think of retreating as not otherwise you just stay into the better end all the time. That makes it more likely you're going to die because you don't leave. And if we can sort of understand that maybe retreating is not failure, you didn't lose if you retreated. You just retreated and you can come back later when you get a better sword and then you come back at them. But if everything is so intense that way, then all of a sudden people don't do things like retreat, and then things just get a little bit more deadly, right? If you can't accept small failures, then all of a sudden it becomes that one big final moment where everyone dies.
Or something worse, I don't know.
Or something worse, something worse happens. And so, and I think there's something interesting about being able to embrace smaller failures.
And this is probably D&D specific, but I feel like there's no opportunity for players to even conceive of retreating as an option. I've seen all sorts of debates about how do you get your players to run away if they're about to die. They probably won't because they're heroes.
But not just because they're heroes. I think it's not just that, to be honest. Yeah. I think it's because D&D as a game is structured around the idea that all combats are matched to your level, right? There's a challenge rating. But players then imagine that any fight is winnable. Any fight is a fair fight that is winnable. And so you shouldn't have to retreat, right? Because you should be able to win this one. And even
I don't think it's even
approached
in the rule books, like, right? Because there's no retreat rule, there's no retreat ability, there's movement abilities.
Whereas in Fate, there are two ways to end a conflict. You have two choices. You either get taken out or you concede. One of those two choices. And what happens is that if you are taken out, which means your antagonists pull you out of the bring you out, they decide what happens to you.
Yeah.
So, and if depending, it might mean that you're killed. It might mean that they capture you and you wake up tied up. If it's like some kind of physical combat, it might mean that they ruin your self-confidence. If it's a sort of a mental combat,
and ruin your reputation if it's social.
Yeah, that ruin your reputation. Now no one will talk to you. So they decide how you're taken out. If you concede, antagonist gets what they want, but you decide how it happens, right? So I think, and also you get fate points. You get extra fate points for conceding. And I think, and that means that fights might end quicker. Like the fights may not drag on if you're like, you know what, I don't think it's worth it for me. So like to get really messed up in this fight, I'm going to just concede.
Don't overinvest and live to see another day or be able to spend things other places.
And then you end up a little bit stronger, and so is that concession a failure? I don't think it's meant to be thought that way. I think it's meant to be like, okay, well, there are like two paths, this path or this path, and then you chose this path rather than that path.
So I think we've gone round a whole bunch of reasons you could fail, ways you could fail, mechanics you could possibly use to fail. It's not necessarily death. It's not necessarily the opposite of success, and it's not necessarily the opposite of progress. So if you can, let us know in the comments what games you enjoy and why, and how did they approach success and failure. Trooper, where can we find you?
You can find me at TrooperSJP on YouTube or on Twitch. That's where I stream normally. You can see me streaming Fate, a Fate game, French Resistance, which is meant to be super, super gritty with a lot of character internal drama, where you have to make choices about who you are as a person. Are you going to kill the civilian witness or are you not? What are you going to do? Are you going to save the art or the people? What are your choices? Do you going to throw people under the bus? So it's a lot of like character work that way. And that's on Fridays at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And you can find me, streaming video games. You can also find me at Academic Foxhole on Twitter, where, because I don't know how to use Twitter correctly, as you could probably tell from this video, all my tweets are like massive long tweet threads about something philosophical, or maybe cats. It's one of those.
Amazing. Thanks. And if you want Josh, then you're in the right place. Subscribe. So thank you everyone for watching. Have an amazing time on your table. But until next time, goodbye.